All right, so welcome everybody as you settle in person and online. Thanks for joining us. It's really wonderful to see all of you here in person and online. My name is Michael Maurais. I serve on the faculty here at Northwest Seminary College as well as ACTS Seminaries, and I moonlight and teach for religious studies at Trinity Western University as well. And one of the things that I do at Northwest is I manage lifelong learning, which this event is really a part of, is an opportunity for those of us who are in the academy, but also those who are not necessarily doing anything formal in the academy or interested in what the academy is up to get together and talk about the Bible, to talk about theology and what all of that means for us today. So I'm really excited for this time that we're going to have together. The last Septuagint seminar that we had was really wonderful and had lots of really great engagements and questions. And that really is the goal of an evening like tonight, is not just for monologues to be delivered, but for dialogues to happen. That's where the real magic happens. So our presenter for the evening is Dr. Jean Maurais, who is joining us from Montreal via Zoom. And we're coming to you from Vancouver here, Langley, on the campus of Trinity Western. So the marvels of technology are such that Jean can join us by distance. And he is the Vice Dean and Professor of Old Testament at the, I'm going to try and get my pronunciation correct here, Faculté de Théologie Évangélique de Montréal. How was it? Good?
Very good.
Okay, good. I mean, I studied two French thinkers for my doctorate, so I probably should have a little bit of that accent at Acadia University. And he is also a fellow of the John Williams Weaver Institute for Septuagint Studies at Trinity Western, a co-sponsor of this event, as well as ACTS and Northwest. And as a Septuagintalist, I got that right, his interests include the text of the Old Testament, applying insights from translation studies and linguistics to ancient translations, and understanding the people who produced these ancient texts and their motivations. He's the author of Characterizing Old Greek Deuteronomy as an Ancient Translation, that's released with Brill in 2022, and is currently working on the Baylor Handbook on the Septuagint for Deuteronomy 1 through 11. His recent research focuses on how language, contact, and cognition can provide a framework to better understand the process that led to the creation of the Septuagint translations. So we're really pleased to have you with us tonight for making time. You're clearly a very busy individual. And likewise, to my left here, we have Dr. Joel Carrico. He is also on the faculty here at Northwest. He's the Assistant Professor of Biblical Studies, and he manages our CBT programs along with myself here at Northwest. He's also a fellow of the John William Weaver's Institute for Septuagint Studies, and his interests lie in understanding ancient Greek translations of the Hebrew Bible, particularly as they relate to the cultures they were produced in. The Book of Exodus and the Pentateuch more broadly are areas of his current research, and he's author of the brand new Death of the Covenant Code, Capital Punishment in Old Greek Exodus in light of Greco-Egyptian law. And that's also released with Brill very, very recently. And I can tell you, I am not a Septuagint scholar. I'm a theological ethicist, but Joel and I lose a lot of time talking about law and morality, and it's very fun. So we'll try not to hijack the conversation here tonight. And he's published articles on Greek Exodus, including the death penalty in OG Exodus in light of Greco-Egyptian legal formulations. And he's a co-author of the upcoming volume on Exodus for the Society of Biblical Literature Commentary on the Septuagint. And that is set to be released just before Jesus returns. Yeah. Given how particular and detailed that work will be.
Yeah, no one knows the day or hour for this thing.
No one knows the day or hour. Yeah. So with that, I will pass the podium on to you, Jean. Jean will be doing a presentation for a period of time. Joel will offer a brief response, and then Dr. Maurais will respond to his response, and then we'll open it up for discussion. So that can be questions in person, comments in person, or online. I have my Zoom open. I can see what you're writing. So if you have any questions you'd like to add into the chat in Zoom, feel free to post those at any time, and I will throw those to our presenter and our respondent. So without further ado, welcome, Dr. Jean Maurais. We're so happy to have you present with us.
Yeah, thank you very much, Michael. Thank you, Joel, for the invitation. It's great to be with you. Thanks, as you say, to the marvels of technology. So I'm very happy to be discussing this topic with you tonight, exploring the relevance of the Septuagint for the study of the Bible. So before I start, let me just share my screen or my PowerPoint here. Does that look okay?
It's great.
Excellent. Okay. Let me just move my Zoom controls out of the way if I can. All right. Okay, so exploring the relevance of the Septuagint for the study of the Bible. Yeah, so many have probably never heard of the Septuagint or know very little about its relevance, right, for the task of interpreting the Bible. So my primary objective tonight is to introduce you to this important corpus of ancient translations. 4 areas where the Septuagint contributes significantly to our understanding of the Christian Bible. So this is basically the roadmap that I have planned for us this evening. First, we'll need to discuss specifically what is the Septuagint, and then this will be followed by the 4 aspects or 4 areas that I just discussed. That is, the Septuagint helps us identify more accurately the text that should be the basis of our translations of the Old Testament. Secondly, it sheds light on the process of Bible translation and all the challenges that are associated with that. Third, as one of the earliest interpretations of the Hebrew Scriptures, the Septuagint opens up interpretative possibilities that can prove helpful even today. And fourth, the Septuagint enables us to better understand the linguistic and conceptual world of the New Testament authors and how they understood and employed the Old Testament scriptures in their writings. So I could have included other points, other aspects in this discussion, such as issues of the biblical canon that we're not really going to get into very much this evening, because as you can imagine, it would take us much beyond the allotted time. So first and foremost, before tackling these 4 areas, we need to address some key issues in relation to the Septuagint to clarify exactly what we are talking about. And one of the primary issues when dealing with the Septuagint is that exactly what is the Septuagint, right? So the term Septuagint refers to a collection of translations of individual books of the Old Testament into Greek. And this translation of the various books that make up our Old Testament spans several centuries. And on top of that, there are other books and additions to existing books that were also added along the way, many of which were composed directly into Greek. So these books are sometimes called apocryphal or deuterocanonical. So if you would buy a Septuagint today, it will include all of these Greek documents under one cover, as this very common edition that you see here on the screen, the Ralph's edition of the Septuagint. But it's really worthwhile to reflect on two points in more detail because they're very important for how we interpret this corpus. And the first is that the Septuagint is not a translation in the same sense as modern translations are, translations such as the NIV or the NRSV. That's because our modern translations are the outcome of a concerted effort, usually a translation committee with oversight. And it's a work that's done in a relatively short time frame, and it follows a set of guidelines and policies. But the situation is very different with the Septuagint. It's in large part a collection of translations produced mainly in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE. But some books were probably translated as late as the 1st century of our era. So these translations were produced by different individuals or groups at different times, and possibly even in different places. So the decision to, the second point is that the decision to group these texts together under one cover in modern editions reflect a peculiar situation in the ancient Christian codices of the 4th and 5th centuries. So I'm talking here mainly of Codex Alexandrinus, Vaticanus, Sinaiticus, which you have here on the screen. So these codices all contain the Greek translations of the Hebrew Bible books, that is the 39 Old Testament books of the Protestant canon. But they also include a few other books which vary according to the codex. So, for example, Codex A, Alexandrinus, will contain 1 through 4 Maccabees, but Codex Vaticanus will omit them entirely. So you have here on the screen a comparison of the books that you will find in the Protestant Bible and in what we might call the Septuagint, right? In quotes here, and the books highlighted in red are those that are not in the Protestant Bible, and sometimes these are additions, as you see there at the end of Daniel. So what Ralph's decided to do when he put together his nice blue covered edition that we saw earlier is that he would group all of these books under one volume. He wanted to include all the books found in at least one of these codices, but that's his decision, right? Other editions vary. The older Sweet edition that was done in Cambridge, I believe, included these books and added also the Book of Enoch, which is not found in these Christian codices. So all that to say that there is little evidence that such a conception of the Septuagint existed in New Testament times. For example, when the scriptures were copied in the form of scrolls or papyrus, right? There might be collections of these, but it's only much later in the 4th and 5th century that we find these books together, and these were collated into modern editions, which give us the impression, right, that we have a corpus called a Septuagint. So these two things, the modern printed editions and the use of the term the Septuagint, will contribute to what we might call an illusion, right, of a single translation. That said, we don't want to throw away that word. It's still useful, and we use it consistently, frequently as a shorthand to designate, right, this rather eclectic collection of mostly Jewish books translated into or composed directly in Greek. So let's talk a little bit about the origins of the Septuagint, and in fact, it relates to the name itself. The name Septuagint is quite ancient. It derives from the letter of Aristeas, a Jewish text, possibly dating to the middle of the 2nd century BCE. And this document recounts how King Ptolemy was eager to have the law of the Jews translated for his library in Alexandria. According to the narrative, he sent a letter to the high priest in Jerusalem asking him to send 72 translators to Alexandria, so 6 from each tribe, along with a copy of the Torah. And a large part of this letter serves to praise the wisdom of the Jews and their law in a Hellenistic context. Finally, the letter ends with the story of the translation produced by these 72 men in 72 days. And the translation is said to be perfect, and the Jewish elders pronounce a curse on those who would add or subtract from it. Now, the letter is considered to be largely fictional, and the legend, if you will, of the translators has been embellished over time. If you look in Philo and the Church Fathers, it just keeps getting better and better each time it's retold. But nevertheless, the 72 became the 70, or the LXX, from which the term Septuagint was coined. There is actually an element of the letter that is probably correct, and that's the fact that the initial translation effort focused on the law, the Pentateuch, right, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and that this translation effort was carried out in Egypt in the 3rd century BCE, likely during the reign of Ptolemy II, Philadelphus. So many Jews were living in Egypt at the time, soldiers, tradespeople, civil servants, and so on. And they were present pretty much everywhere, including Alexandria, the new capital that was founded by Alexander in the year 332. In fact, it's said that within a century of its foundation, Alexandria was already one of the largest cities of its time, second only to Rome in importance in the ancient world. And the city was divided into 5 districts, one of which was the Jewish quarter. Now, this is much later, but it's estimated that in Roman times, Jews made up 35% of the city's total population, which was estimated at over 500,000 people. So that's a sizable Jewish population, maybe 2 centuries after the period of what we're talking about here for the initial translation. So Greek rapidly gained prominence even outside Alexandria, replacing Aramaic as the lingua franca. And this is probably one of the main reasons for the translation of the Old Testament. There was widespread writing. We found correspondence, contracts, inscriptions. And it's not hard to imagine that translators could be found in this context because there was a lot of translation going on between the native Egyptian language, Greek, Aramaic, and so forth. In fact, the oldest manuscript of the Septuagint have been found in Egypt. And the one that you see here, Ryland 458, is the earliest and dates from the 2nd century BCE. And it was also found right in Egypt. So this is our little intro to what is the Septuagint. Now let's get into the 4 aspects that we discussed earlier in the introduction. So first, the Septuagint, an indispensable tool for the study of the Hebrew Bible. Our modern translations are primarily based on the earliest full text of the Old Testament, which is a codex from the 10th century, Codex Leningradensis, or the Leningrad Codex, which is a representative of the Masoretic text. This is, on the whole, a very reliable witness to the text of the Old Testament. But the copying of manuscripts, as you can imagine, even when it's done very carefully, will inevitably lead to changes, or what we might call scribal mistakes and whatnot, right? And there might even be changes that are deliberate, as we will see later. So part of the work of scholars is to compare manuscripts and make sure that we base our work on the earliest recoverable text. In many cases, the textual history of a book can be compared to a tree. And I think this is a nice way to conceptualize things, with different manuscripts placed on different branches of this textual tree. For example, here you have a stemma or tree of Deuteronomy made by Benjamin Seymour, where he attempts to place the various manuscripts that have been found in relation to each other. And in some cases, it's very difficult because many of these manuscripts are very fragmentary. So that's perhaps why there's question mark next to a lot of them. But in any case, it's very useful because you have the archetype at the top, right? And then the various branches as they seem to be relating to each other. So as you can see, the Masoretic text that we're just discussing is on the left and descends from the archetype in a rather direct fashion. The other 2 main witnesses, the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Septuagint, are further along a different branch. They share this branch right in the early stages, and then they diverge into their own separate branch. Now, you might ask, how can we put a Greek translation on a tree of Hebrew manuscripts, right? Well, that's because the Greek translation is rather literal, as we might say. So it's not very difficult to discern what would be the underlying Hebrew source text, especially when we compare it with the other Hebrew manuscripts. So that's how we can pretty much figure out where it belongs in the textual tree. Now, the Septuagint being on a different branch means that there are a number of differences with the Masoretic text, but these are often relatively minor, like harmonizations. Now, we're talking about Deuteronomy here. It might be different. It will be different for other books, but this is the one that I'm most familiar with. And so for Deuteronomy, those of you that are familiar with the book will know that it repeats many expressions, such as, the land that I swore to give to your fathers, or doing what is right and good in the sight of the Lord. Now, these reoccur frequently throughout the book. And in our Masoretic text, or MT, as we abbreviate it, they will often appear a little different from one instance to the next. But when we look at these in the Septuagint, they are often harmonized. They all look the same. And there's a good reason to think that that was already the case in the translation's Hebrew source text. Another example that we'll discuss later, now if we look at a concrete example, is in Deuteronomy 6:13, where we find the command to serve the Lord exclusively. As you'll see, if we compare the Masoretic text version to the Septuagint version, the Septuagint version is slightly longer, the text that you see in bold here. It adds, and to him you shall cling. And we might ask, okay, why do we have this addition here? But it turns out that it's not haphazard if we consider that the command, a similar command, is found later in the book in 10:20. It includes this clinging command in the middle, right there. So this is considered an assimilation, as is often found in other witnesses, such as the Samaritan Pentateuch. So whoever was responsible for the Septuagint of 6:13 or its underlying Hebrew text, either deliberately harmonized both, right, to make them look the same, or perhaps when he was copying it, had the text memorized, right, and from memory wrote down the longer version. It's hard to know exactly what occurred in these cases. Now, there are situations that are a little different from this. In this case, right, the Septuagint version is clearly secondary. It seems to be harmonizing, but that's not always the case. In 1 Samuel 2:33, another rather straightforward example, there's a prophecy on the house of Eli the priest. And here, MT seems to be missing something, right? When it says, all the increase in your house shall die, men are, yeah, so the Tanakh translations here, translation adds as ordinary men, perhaps, trying to make sense of the difficult Hebrew text. And in fact, this passage has occasioned all kinds of difficulties for translators who focus solely on the Masoretic text here. But on the other hand, if we look at the Septuagint text, we see that it adds, there's a longer version, and it adds the phrase by the sword in this location, which leads to the full phrase, they will die by the swords of men, or the sword of man. Now, that makes a little more sense. And what's interesting is that this reading is also supported by an ancient Hebrew manuscript among the Dead Sea Scrolls, and is normally accepted as the original. In this case, our modern translations often adopt the Septuagint reading or make a note of it for their readers. So this is nothing surprising for many of our modern translations. They will often look at these things and try to incorporate what seems to be an obvious better reading in such cases. Now, there are more difficult cases, and one of these is found in Deuteronomy 32:8. In this verse, we find a description of God, or the Most High, setting the boundaries of various nations according to the number of, and this is where the variant differences appear, right? In the Hebrew Masoretic text, we find that the criteria is the sons of Israel. That's what's used to fix the boundaries. But in the Septuagint, we rather have the sons of God, or the divine sons, as is rendered here in the New English translation of the Septuagint. But here also, as in 1 Samuel, the Septuagint reading is also attested by a Dead Sea Scroll manuscript. So this means that it's likely not the work of the translator, but that this version already existed in his Hebrew source text. And here also, the consensus is that the Septuagint reading is likely the original. And this is another situation where the Septuagint helps us get beyond our most important Hebrew manuscripts, the MT, to an earlier form of the text. In this case, we could say maybe a little more on this. The modification seems deliberate. This is not what might be called a scribal error, as perhaps the First Samuel example was. The modification towards sons of Israel might have been made to avoid the impression, giving the impression of, some kind of polytheism in the Pentateuch. That's despite the fact that the divine council idea is still present elsewhere in the Old Testament. The Pentateuch is seen as the canon within the canon for Jews in this period. And this modification will also have been part of a broader series of small changes that affect this verse, and also Exodus 1:5 and Genesis 46:27. So in these two texts I just named, there's a mention of the number of Israel's or Jacob's sons, his family really, that go down to Egypt. And what's interesting is that the Septuagint has 75 people, or counts 75 people, but the Hebrew Masoretic text has 70. The individuals are counted differently, but why? It seems that this has to do with the table of nations in Genesis 11, which contains 70 nations. So when you put all of this together, right, it seems like that ancient scribes linked these texts and made the number of Israel's sons match the number of nations, right? Because their boundaries were fixed in accordance to that number. So it all becomes one equation, if you will. Now, our translations usually note these differences, but they don't all follow the Septuagint in these passages. These are just a few examples, all relatively minor. But I hope to have shown that the Septuagint's role is important, right, when it comes to establishing the text of our Old Testament books. What is going to be the basis of our translations? Well, we need the Septuagint. And it's good to know that many of these differences, and the most significant ones, have been known for a long time and have already been incorporated into our modern translations, either in the main text, as I was saying, or in a note. Nevertheless, the work of establishing the text, what we call textual criticism, is an ongoing project. Okay, let's move on to our second aspect, which deals with the task of Bible translation. So this is another area where the Septuagint is useful in helping us conceptualize the task of biblical translation. And in fact, the Septuagint is, when we think of it, near the beginning of a long tradition of biblical translation. It's perhaps even the most ancient and significant ancestor, the granddaddy of our modern translations. It's interesting in this context to consult the prologue of the book of Ben Sira, or Sirach, which dates to the second half of the 2nd century BCE. It contains one of the earliest references to the Greek translations of the Hebrew scriptures, and it highlights a number of relevant points. So let me read it for you. So you are invited, therefore, to read it. This is his translation of his grandfather's work. You're invited, therefore, to read it with goodwill and attention, and to be indulgent in cases where, despite our diligent labor in translating, we may seem to have rendered some phrases imperfectly. For what was originally expressed in Hebrew does not have exactly the same sense when translated into another language. Not only this book, but even the law itself, the prophecies, and the rest of the books differ not a little when read in the original. So this is the reference, this last phrase, to existing translations from Hebrew to Greek, which would probably be the Septuagint of the Pentateuch and prophets, and the rest is a little more difficult to ascertain. I continue. When I came to Egypt in the 38th year of the reign of Ur-Getes and stayed for some time, I found opportunity for no little instruction. It seemed highly necessary that I should myself devote some diligence and labor to the translation of this book for those living abroad who wish to gain learning and are disposed to live according to the law. So there's a few interesting points that I want to highlight in this text that relate to the task of translation. And the first, in the very first sentence that I've read here, talks about, highlights the difficulties related to the task of translating. I'm sure some of you have already experienced this. The task of translation is a very daunting one, and there's many reasons for this. One of them is that the distance between languages can introduce a considerable level of complexity and makes it more difficult to find easy equivalence between one element of the source language and another of the target language. And this is the case with the Septuagint, since its translators were working from a Semitic language and rendering it into an Indo-European one. What's useful, though, is that Greek is relatively flexible when it comes to word order, even if this can introduce some strange turns of phrase for readers or listeners of the time. You might think of it as the way the character Yoda speaks in Star Wars, right? Always in motion is the future. Or named must your fear be, before banish it you can. Sometimes I'm sure the Septuagint must have sounded a little bit like this to its first listeners, and it's hard work to do this translation work. Another thing that I want to highlight in this short text is that there are inevitable differences between a translation and its original, and this is seen in the second half of the first paragraph. And we'll discuss this more in detail in the next point. And the third point I wanted to highlight is near the end, in the last sentence, right? Why is translation done? And or the grandson here says, right, it's for those living abroad who wish to gain learning and are disposed to live according to the law. So often, right, it's the broader diffusion of our work that motivates translation. It's thought that in Egypt in the 3rd century, that Hebrew was not as prevalent as it used to be, or not known, not spoken and understood by Jews, by a majority of Jews, and this might be one of the reasons why the Septuagint translations were initiated, despite the letter of Aristeas stating that it was perhaps for prestige, right, for the king's library. There are many theories that have been put forth on this, and we don't have a whole lot of data, but certainly that the linguistic factor and the diffusion of the Hebrew scriptures was part of the motivations. So recent studies of the Septuagint have tried to avoid prescriptive assessments of what is a good translation, and instead try to favor a descriptive approach, using, among other things, descriptive translation studies. A generation or two ago, just to give you some context, Septuagint translators were often criticized either for their clumsy style when people compared their Greek to classical Greek, or they were criticized for their lack of precision as translators, because some thought that precision requires always using the same Hebrew Greek equivalents, especially when you're working in a legal text, right? But this is very prescriptive. We think we know what they should have been doing, right, in terms of their style and in terms of their approach. But in a descriptive approach, we rather try to understand how the process came about without passing judgment. Rather, we try to figure out, or to discern what might have been the objectives of the translation, its function, and so on. And this is the reason why we can ask some questions, such as the two you see here on the screen. To what extent does the translators seek to reproduce the style and constructions of the source language, or to favor the conventions of the target language? The second question is related to the first and provides some answers. What is this translation's intended function? What is its place in relation to other translations? And what concrete needs is it intended to meet? And the answers to these questions will provide an orientation or an idea as to the translation approach and the style that's favored. Now, the difficulty with the Septuagint is that we don't have we can't interview the translators and ask them what their intentions were and why they adopted this approach and not that other approach, and so forth. And so we're constrained to look at basically what we have before us, right? The source text by and large, and the target text, and try to figure out, okay, how they did things and what might be the motivations behind this. So if we look at a text like Deuteronomy 1:1, you don't need to know Greek and Hebrew to notice that by and large, the translation approach favored by this translator and most Septuagint translators really favors the reproduction of Hebrew constructions. It's almost a word-for-word, what we would call a word-for-word approach. There are only a few omissions at the bottom of the middle column there. This is not systematic, and there are more idiomatic Greek phrases to be found. And in fact, despite the word-for-word approach in this verse particularly, the Greek is by and large conventional Greek. But if you look at the book as a whole, this general approach ends up producing a work that definitely has a Hebrew flavor. And this is very much in keeping with many translations today. Many people prefer a so-called literal translation because it's often associated with a more faithful and biblical style. So another thing to note here is that you can see how various manuscripts, these are later manuscripts, added the phrase kai anameson to correspond to these Hebrew words to bring it even closer to the Hebrew. And this was an approach that became more popular as time went on and revisions were made of the Septuagint text, even though it produces a repetition here of anameson that's unconventional Greek. But even in this format, even in this mode of translation, there's considerable space for creativity. If we go back to 32:8, where we were earlier, we also find this kind of one-to-one equivalence between the Hebrew and Greek text, but there is variation introduced in this framework. In Hebrew, the first two lines are syntactically parallel. It's basically the same syntax, but the translator employs two different constructions in Greek. So on the first line, you'll have a hote and an imperfect, and on the second line, a hos and an aorist. So conversely, you'll find two nouns in Hebrew describing the people, right? The nations and the peoples, as is rendered here in this translation. But the translator levels these two and chooses the word ethne for both, right? And you see in green on the other side. This is actually in keeping with the translator's preferred word for designating peoples other than Israel. So when he's talking about peoples outside of Israel, his preferred word is ethne. But when he's talking about Israel, he will usually employ the word laos, right? So there's what I'm trying to say is that there's a motivation for this semantic leveling that we are observing here. So all this to say that it reminds us that there's a number of factors and imperatives that go into Bible translation. We might ask, okay, which is best? And this is a question I often get. And the answer is, well, it depends, right? Which translation is best? It depends. The intended function of the Septuagint of Deuteronomy was probably different than that of later revisions, like Aquila, which really mirrored the source text almost mechanically. So perhaps Septuagint Deuteronomy was more of a facilitating text that still retained the prestige associated with its Hebrew source. So the result is that we'll not want to judge a translation on its style or its approach, rather on whether it fulfills its intended function. And the same is true for modern translations, right? There are a variety of options for us, and it all depends on what function it's intended to fulfill. So again, here, I think the Septuagint can help us better appreciate our modern translations and all of their variety and the work that goes into producing them. It's truly a daunting task. All right, let's look at the fourth point here, which relates to translation and interpretation. You may have heard the saying that all translation is interpretation, right? This is something that we hear oftentimes. And a statement that would be a little extreme to accept at face value. But we do have to admit that before producing a translation, we need to properly understand the source text, right? When you're working translating, you need to know what you're translating, first of all. So in this sense, interpretation precedes translation. In many, and perhaps most cases, the meaning of the text that is translated presents no major difficulties, and it's not difficult to produce an equivalent meaning in the target language. But that said, interpretation remains a challenge. And maybe for simplicity's sake, we could conceive of two types of interpretation. The first I would label unavoidable interpretation, and the second, deliberate interpretation. So let's look a little bit at those two. Unavoidable interpretation is where the translator is obliged, it has to resolve an ambiguity that is present in the text, or one that stems from the mismatch between the languages. In other words, sometimes it's the text itself that's unclear. What does it mean exactly? Other times, a word in the text can take on, or an expression can take on several meanings in the source language, and those have no direct equivalent in the target language, and therefore the translator must choose in between various options. An example of this, and a thorny problem for translators, is the rendering of the Hebrew name Eved. It can designate a number of things, from a slave to a servant to a minister. Think of a civil servant today. How to render it into English is problematic because its most frequent match, slave, historically speaking, is often associated with chattel slavery in our culture. It's a situation that's quite different in many respects from the Eved in many Old Testament contexts. So to take but one example, modern translators working on Exodus 21:2 have to make a decision here. Which English equivalent is appropriate for the word Eved that appears here? When you buy a Hebrew male Eved, what's the right term, right? So in the NRSV, you have the choice of slave, whereas in the NIV, they opt for a servant. Now, in our context, a servant has more autonomy than a slave, and perhaps also a little more than this individual in the Exodus law, right? Who's basically serving his master for 6 years, right? So anyway, the purpose of this example is not to argue in favor of either option. I simply want to point out, to illustrate, that a translator has to choose one or the other options, or maybe make up a third that will maybe alleviate the problem, because there's no term in English that perfectly matches the Hebrew. But what's important here is that the translator cannot avoid the problem. He has to make a choice, and this is what I mean by an unavoidable interpretation. And by the way, this is why Moses Silva says that learning original languages doesn't always clarify the meaning of the text. In fact, the knowledge of the biblical languages often makes us aware of more possibilities or ambiguities than the translators had to resolve for us, that we don't notice when we read the text in translation. Now, if we get back to the Septuagint, it provides, as a translation, it provides us with many such interpretations, and these actually raise useful questions for us. There's an example of this found in Deuteronomy 25, 2 and 3, are the junction, really, of these two texts. So this is a passage that deals with a measured punishment, right? Someone is found guilty, and he will be beaten in the judge's presence, with a number of lashes proportionate to the offense. That's the translation of the Hebrew in the NRSV. 40 lashes may be given, but not more. So we know that the Hebrew syntax here allows for a more permissive interpretation, right? They may strike him. It's not an obligation. But it could also be interpreted as a more directive one. They shall strike him. That's also a possibility in the syntax with the Yichtal form here. And so what does a translator do? He's faced with a choice. He has to decide how he's going to render this verb, and our Septuagint translator opts for the Greek future tense, which in this context indicates a command. So as you see on the text on the right, they shall beat him, with the number 40. So what was a permission, perhaps, in the Hebrew becomes more forceful obligation. There's another element of ambiguity, and that's found at the end of verse 2 and the beginning of verse 3. Does the expression in number or proportionate, right, with the number or in number, does it belong to verse 2, as is indicated by the Masoretic signs here, or does it belong to verse 3, as is shown in the majority of Greek manuscripts? Now, the first option favors a number of blows that can vary according to the crime. You will strike him according to his guilt in number, right? The second option seems to apply a fixed 40 blows, right? By the number 40, you will strike him. And what's interesting is that the second interpretation is the one that becomes predominant in ancient Judaism. This is exactly how the prescription is explained later in the Mishnah 40-1, right? By dividing the verses differently than what we find in the Masoretic text, or said otherwise, dividing the verses just like we see here in the Greek text. This is also what we find in Josephus, who, for this passage, and he even takes the 40 blows and applies it to other laws in Deuteronomy without explicit warrant from the text. And of course, many of you will be familiar with Paul's own description of his punishment, the punishment that he suffered. And he said this 5 times he received from the Jews the 40 strokes -1. So in this case, it's difficult to say whether the translator read it, how he divided the verses, since he's not responsible for the verse divisions that we observe in later manuscripts. But it's certainly conceivable that he was operating in a context where interpretations of these texts were circulating and probably influencing his translation in places. On other occasions, there are no precise issues of meaning or equivalence between languages, but it seems the translator wants to avoid an interpretation of the text that he considers erroneous, and it will therefore direct the reader towards the interpretation of his choice. And maybe there's often not an absolute boundary between obligatory and deliberate interpretation. One can give rise to the other. Difficulty can give rise to a more creative interpretation. But here's a case that we find quite often that's well known in the Septuagint. The Hebrew word mizbeach is used to describe a variety of altars in the Pentateuch and elsewhere. But the translators of the Pentateuch want to make sure that the distinction between 2 types of altars, legitimate and illegitimate altars, is clear to their readers. So when the context indicates that it's an altar to a foreign god, the translator will use the term bomos, as you see there in Deuteronomy 7:5. But when it comes to an altar to the Lord, he uses a neologism, thusiasterion, and this neologism, if we can call it that, first occurs in Exodus. It's derived from the noun thusia, sacrifice, right? So this is a creative way of making sure that readers understand that, okay, we're talking about different types of altars here, and you need to be sure which altar you deal with appropriately. So perhaps because of all this, the Septuagint provides us with avenues of interpretation, maybe not always the best ones, but at least it shows us that other people before us have tried to solve many of the same difficulties that we face today when we try to interpret the Bible. So in this sense, we can maybe think of the Septuagint as the first biblical commentary. Now, commentary might be maybe a bit of a strong word, but in a sense, it already interprets the text for us. Now let's look at our last point, New Testament authors and their world. So there's a few areas that I want to highlight here where the Septuagint influences New Testament authors. The first is style. New Testament authors seem to be familiar with the Greek style of the Septuagint and often reproduce the same turns of phrase that might otherwise seem strange. You know, the Yoda style I was talking about earlier. An example of this is the narrative style of Luke's gospel. which often employs what some people call Septuagintalisms. So they're Greek instructions. I have them in red here that are really frequent in the narrative portions of the Greek Old Testament. And so these are not found normally in Greek outside of the Bible, but Luke especially likes to include these, the kai egeneto, kai idu, and kai egeneto kai. The kai here would absolutely not be necessary in Greek. In fact, it probably sounds a little strange in this position. It happened in one of those days, and he was teaching. So yeah, it sounds a little bit strange to our ears. But why is Luke doing this, right? Maybe your question. And it's probably a case here where the repeated use of these Septuagintalisms, as we might call them, serve the purpose of giving the narrative a certain scriptural or biblical style, right? It's in the fashion of Old Testament narratives. It's the continuation of these narratives. Another way that the Septuagint influences or helps our reading of the New Testament is that there are a number of words that have specialized meanings in the Septuagint that are also used in the New Testament in a similar way. You can think of evangelizomai, to proclaim the good news of salvation. We find in Isaiah 40, for example, which is also employed in the New Testament. And the good news becomes, right, the good news of Jesus or the coming kingdom, right? This is a specialized usage that's taken up from the Septuagint and applied more specifically to Jesus. And the same could be said of other words like doxa, ecclesia, especially in Paul. Now, ecclesia, you might sometimes hear some definitions of these words that are based on etymology, right? Ecclesia. That's probably not the best way to look at this word. In fact, if you look at its usage in the Septuagint, this is a term employed to designate the community of Israel, the assembly of Israel. It's a very common term in the Greek of this period to designate an assembly, even a public assembly. But it's more than that, right? It's the assembly of the people of God. That's what it becomes in the Septuagint, and it's taken up in the New Testament to designate this new people of God, right? The church, as we might call it. And then, of course, you have key concepts like kurios, which is a translation of the Tetragrammaton in the Septuagint, so the divine name, which is applied to Jesus in the New Testament. Hoon, that he who is, right? A translation of the divine name in Exodus 3, which is taken up in various places in the New Testament, in Revelation, for example, to speak of God as the one being, right? The one who is, who was, and will be. So these are all three reasons why the Septuagint is really indispensable as a background to the New Testament. And another significant aspect of this relationship between these two corpuses is the use of the Old Testament scriptures in the New. And I want to quickly go through one rather simple example here to illustrate this point. And it's the relationship between the Deuteronomy 6:13 passage we saw earlier and the temptation narrative in Matthew 4 and Luke 4. So if you look at these texts side by side, you see that Jesus or Satan says to Jesus, "All these I will give you if you fall down and worship me." And Jesus said to him, "Away with you, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only." So you see here that there are a couple of differences, right? The verb is not the same. The Deuteronomy passage has fear the Lord, whereas the quotation has the verb worship. And then the Matthew and Luke passage add the adverb only, or serve only him. Now, it seems clear, right, that the author of these two Gospels is quoting from the Old Testament. The text is introduced by the phrase, right, it is written, gegraptai. So does it go back to a different text than those that we have, either in Hebrew or Greek, or is there some other explanation? Right, so there are several factors to consider in such a comparison, but it seems here that the Greek text of Deuteronomy did contain fear, and that there's no reason to see worship there before its use in the New Testament. There will be some manuscripts, some later manuscript that will harmonize these two passages, but it's unlikely that the gospel author had a different text than the one we have. So what other possibilities could we consider? Could Matthew have adapted the Old Testament text for some reason? Well, in this case, the answer seems to be yes. The verb to worship is in fact found in the proposal that Satan makes to Jesus, right? I will give you all this if you will bow down and worship me, right? So the repetition of Deuteronomy 6:13, of worship in Deuteronomy 6:13 seems to be related more directly to this invitation. To fear God and to serve him is to worship him. And of course, worshiping anyone other than God is problematic, and perhaps this also serves as bringing that issue into focus. And the addition of alone perhaps also underlines this point. The worship of God must be exclusive, and this is not at odds with the wider context of the quotation in Deuteronomy 6. You have the Decalogue, that's just a chapter prior. So the addition of only here might have been thought necessary to make the implied meaning more explicit. I think it's helpful in this context to make a distinction between what we consider today as a quotation or best practices when quoting a text, with the requirements of precision, down to mistakes that might be present in a quoted text that we have to reproduce, right? This is how we deal with quotations today, and the way that authors quoted others in antiquity. The fact that the New Testament authors state, as is written, or so and so said, does not seem to constrain them to a word-for-word quotation. In fact, we often find that there is freedom to adapt the Old Testament text to the New Testament context, as seems to be the case here. So this particular example is part of the gospel writer's wider strategy of showing how Jesus obeys divine law and overcomes temptation, something that Israel was unable to do in the desert. So in retracing the steps of Israel, Jesus, in Matthew narrative especially, Jesus shows that he is the obedient son. So the Septuagint helps us to understand, by comparing these texts, to understand the connections that the gospel author wanted to make and the aspects that he wanted to highlight especially. Now, if you were curious and want to find out more about this, I've done a few videos with Larry Perkins, who's really an expert in these matters. And this is actually an example that we discussed in one of these videos. You can find them on the Weavers Institute YouTube channel. So to conclude then, I hope I've given you a glimpse of how the Septuagint can help us better understand the Bible. It helps us better ascertain our Old Testament text. As the forerunner of our modern translations, it helps us understand and appreciate the task of biblical translation. As the first commentary or interpretation of the Old Testament, it occupied an important place in the development of Jewish traditions and Christian teaching. So I think that familiarizing oneself with its contents and even the so-called apocryphal books can be of great benefit for understanding the Bible. So I would advise you then, to conclude, to go and buy a Septuagint. There are many options now in several modern languages, and even in English, you have at least 3 translations easily available, and even freely on the web, such as the New English translation of the Septuagint here, which was made in part by fellows of the Weavers Institute that some of you know very well. So thank you so much for your attention.
Well, thank you so much for a very engaging presentation. I was writing a lot of notes and I have a lot of thoughts and a lot of questions, but I will hold forth on those because I'm sure a lot of people are in a similar boat to me. But Joel, you have the first chance to respond. So I will give you some space to respond to
Sure.
what we just heard, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Sean. That was excellent. I think everyone can attest. And the subject is clearly on people's minds. What do we do with this Septuagint? Considering we had, was it 90 people who originally signed up, and we have about 35, 40 people total here listening. So it's clearly something that people are talking about. When I frequent kind of the online sphere, I find people talking about the Septuagint and asking questions about it pretty frequently. So that we have something like this from such a wonderful scholar like yourself, it's really helpful. We're really thankful to have someone like you out there who's on the front lines of Septuagint research and is willing to bring that to not only the specialists, because it's a really specialized field. I don't know if you all know that, but it really is. And so you can easily get locked in that ivory tower and not come down and try and bring it to other people. And Jean is not like that at all. And so thank you so much for this excellent overview.
He even quotes Star Wars.
He even quoted Star Wars.
Right?
Yeah.
Septuagint scholars are people too.
Yeah. Almost not, but yes. Yeah, so it was an excellent overview. There's not really a lot I could add. I think there's a lot of like questions and further proddings that I would want to do. I don't think I want to ask you too many questions because I want to open up things for a Q&A, which we should probably tell people that is okay for them to do now.
Yep.
Okay.
If you would like to put a question in the chat, we already have one, and people in person too have your questions or comments at the ready.
Yeah, so in the chat and then here live as well, absolutely. We want to hear, Jean wants to hear your questions. Some things that came to my mind were just the kind of the burning issue of, you mentioned this translation, you give us this kind of basic background, but what was going on? What was the function of this text originally, right? At least the Pentateuch, let's say, in the 3rd century. Why were they creating this? I know you had mentioned in Alexandria, but also in scholarship today, there's the late Jim Aitken, just a giant in Septuagint studies and biblical studies for that matter. He said perhaps it could also have been translated outside of the big city in more of the countryside. And so then maybe that's saying something even about like the kinds of thoughts that are going on among the more quote unquote common folk, not the elites in the cities. And so what is the function of this text? And I know if I ask you that, you'll probably say, we're not sure. So we're not quite sure yet. But it definitely, you prodded and poked at that in such a way that I think it really is a pressing question, and we need more people to be doing research in this area to help with that. Another thing that I was wondering about was, hey, so we have this Septuagint that's attesting to a Hebrew text that comes before the Masoretic text, yet we have this bias. Do we not? In evangelical circles, at least, I don't know what circles you all come from, but there's this bias towards the Masoretic text. And I think Jean has done a good job here just kind of poking a hole. So just a little hole in that, and perhaps it can deflate a little bit that bias towards the Masoretic text. And maybe there's something more to looking to the Septuagint, but at the same time, you were mentioning there's these harmonizing kind of tendencies in at least in Deuteronomy, and we don't want to paint too broad of a picture here and say that everybody's doing that. It does happen in Exodus too, because I work in Exodus, and there is a harmonizing that's going on. So it's like, on the one hand, we have this old text, older than MT, perhaps 1,300 years or something older than MT. But on the other hand, it seems to have already been, I'm going to use the word corrupted, that's not the right term, but it's harmonizing, it's changing, and it's not sticking to that original. So maybe at some point, Jean, you can try and help guide us for where our biases should lie, or maybe someone else can ask that question as well. One thing that you didn't mention that I thought was perhaps could be a topic of discussion going forward is kind of the bigger divergences that we find in the Septuagint. So you've shown us some smaller ones, and I think no one would really, there might not be any anxiety emerging when you see these kinds of changes. They seem pretty standard stock. Okay, we get it. But then when we think of something like the book of Jeremiah, which is about an 1/8 shorter in the Septuagint version. So how do we think about that? Or the tabernacle account, the book of Exodus, chapters 35 to 40, which are also quite different than the Masoretic text. Or the books of Samuel, where there's also these kind of textual issues. I'd be interested to hear what you have to say to that if somebody else doesn't have that question as well. Um, but those are some of the more or the bigger, more I'm going to say problematic or challenging. Let's say challenging textual variants going on in the Septuagint. So yeah, those are a few things that I'm interested in. I'm wondering if you'll speak to more towards, or if other people have questions here. I think a question that I have coming out of this, probably the biggest question besides these more theoretical, biblical studies-based questions, is how will someone go about engaging with this first commentary, given its prestigious place in the history of Judaism and Christianity, that the New Testament authors, this is their Bible, really. This is the Bible of the early church. So how do we engage with it better? How do we bring it more into our lives? How do we find the language of the Septuagint in the New Testament? Because you mentioned evangelizomai, to bring good news, doxa, glory. Well, when we're reading an English translation, people aren't picking up on these things, right? And if they don't read their Septuagint, they're not picking up on these things. So how do we better engage the language? How do we get at this first commentary in a way that's accessible to us and not just to the scholars, to those who work in the field? So maybe that last question I will pose to you, and then open up the floor to the rest.
Thank you. So John, if you would like to respond, and then we can field some more questions.
Okay. Well, thank you, Joel. Yes, that last question is very relevant, and it can seem a daunting task, right? To delve into a work like the Septuagint, which seems to be such a niche area, and especially if someone does not have any knowledge of Greek, how would one go about delving into it? Maybe if I can take a step back, if you do know some Greek, there are now some very nice readers' editions of the Septuagint that are out there that are not too expensive, relatively speaking. So reader's edition means that you'll have the Greek text, and then in the apparatus you have a vocabulary list for all of the more uncommon words. So that really helps in the reading of the Greek text, which is obviously ideal, but it's not available to everyone. The other option would be to really pick up one of these English translations that I mentioned. In the NETS translation, so New English Translation, you have introductions to the books that will go through some of the specificities of each one, and there you can just start reading and maybe comparing with your English translation and see what's different. Of course, you might not pick up everything, but one of the things that the NETS tries to do is to communicate this one might say strangeness of peculiarities of the Greek text, and so that the English reader can be more aware of what's going on there without even having a knowledge of Greek. Another thing that's helpful, especially in relation to the New Testament, is to go, I mentioned this very briefly at the end, is to go read the apocryphal books. Often as Protestants, we tend to ignore them, but they're very useful to understand like I said earlier, the conceptual world of New Testament authors. I mean, it's hard to read sections in Wisdom of Solomon, for example, and not see the parallels in Paul and in Romans especially. So this will be very useful, I think, to people in terms of getting a sense of what's going on and how the Septuagint can inform their reading of the New Testament especially. Now you said the Bible of the early church. I would be very careful with that phrase. I would nuance it, because as I said earlier, the Septuagint is not a collection. We have to stop thinking of it as a collection. So in that sense, the use of Bible might be misleading, as if Paul quotes the Septuagint means that he accepts the entirety of the corpus that we find in the Ralph's edition as his Bible. That is not the case. People probably employed various individual manuscripts of books, and it's very it would be too much of a step for us to go to assume from that they accepted, say, the entire corpus that we imagine today. Anyway, I'll leave it at that. I don't know if you want to pursue it further.
No, excellent, thank you. Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree. Yeah, I was just using the nomenclature of the day, but for sure.
Yeah,
Okay.
if there's time left over, you can re-engage the Septuagint jujitsu if you like. But we have some questions already online, starting with David. And just to avoid that sort of awkward, like, do I unmute my mic and speak? I'll just read the questions if people are fine with that. Not to sort of hijack your questions, but just to make things a little bit easier with sound and tech. So David asks, thank you for the talk. Could you comment on the difference in Genesis 3:15, bruise head heel in the Masoretic text versus watch head heel in the New English translation, and how this may relate to Romans 16:20a, the God of peace will soon crush Satan under your feet. That's ESV. So it's in the chat if you want to look at the text.
Yeah.
You scroll right up there. That's some intricate cross readings there, but hopefully I sort of nailed that down, hopefully for you.
I thought
Yeah.
I wanted hard questions.
Yeah.
That's not an easy one. I'm not very familiar with the this particular issue, so I'm not sure I can speak to it competently. Yeah, so it's the rendition of the verb to seek, right? Shuf, right?
Shoot.
Yeah. Bruise, which is understood differently, is tereo in Greek, to guard. Yeah. So there's a there's a difference there. I haven't looked at it in detail. I'm afraid I can't provide a detailed answer, a satisfactory answer right off the cuff here. But you're right. There seems to be a connection with Romans 16 for sure. But on the surface of it, it looks like the connection is made with what we might call the semantics of the Hebrew text, right, and not the Greek itself. That would be my and that happens, right? It's the New Testament authors obviously quote the Old Testament very often, but it's not always the Septuagint text that they employ. Sometimes it's rather well, it's hard to say really. They seem to be quoting the Hebrew, or maybe translating it on the fly. There's also places where they seem to be using one of the revisions of the Septuagint that was in circulation. We have some evidence that they're quotation match extent revisions that we have found. So there's a variety of options here that they had, and so that will often depend on the author, on the passage, on the context. It seems like the New Testament authors were not constrained to using always the same version, if we can call it that, when they employed their Old Testament scriptures.
Oh, that's very helpful. Do you have any questions in person? We have another question online, but if there's anybody in person who'd like to.
Yeah, maybe just a bit of clarity. You had kind of talked a little bit about sort of a bit of that source criticism using the Septuagint to sort of try to track a little bit closer to what the original tradition would have been. But you also mentioned using the Dead Sea Scrolls alongside the Septuagint. And I'm curious on how that plays out, how much you're actually depending more so on the Dead Sea Scrolls than you are the Septuagint to kind of understand the text more specifically. Is that clear?
Yes, actually, thank you. This touches on one of Joel's points earlier when he talked about what's often seen as a bias towards MT when we're trying to assess what is the earliest recoverable text or the original text. The task of textual criticism is a difficult one, and because it's not just a matter of counting noses. Okay, you have, three ancient witnesses that have this reading and only two that have the other reading, so I'm going to go with the three here because there are 3 votes against 2. It doesn't work that way, right? It's really, you have to go on the strength of the reading. Which one is more likely to have given rise to the other is often the deciding criteria, or you can work it backwards. Which is the most easy to explain as a deviation from the other reading. So you have to look at it both ways and see what seems more likely. So in terms of the Septuagint and Qumran scrolls, well, the difficulty with the Septuagint is that it's not always easy to know whether the difference that we see with the Masoretic text is something that's a translational variation, or if it's really an attestation of a different Hebrew witness. And so when you have another Hebrew source that has the same difference, then you can be pretty certain that you are dealing with a Hebrew variant that you can then compare to the Masoretic text and see, okay, which might be the earliest one. And so this is where you have to compare to, like I said just earlier, try to figure out which has given rise to the other. So when you work that way, you're not biased towards one manuscript or the other. You're just trying to figure out on a case-by-case basis which is the best or most probable original reading for this particular instance. Now, having said that, it's not always easy. It's not always clear. It's not always obvious which has given rise to the other. And so sometimes you have to take a step back and look at patterns and say, okay, does this manuscript tend to harmonize very often? Because this looks like a harmonization here, but it could also be an omission, right? If you look at it the other way, something can have been added or can have been removed. And so when you look at several occurrences throughout the book, then sometimes a clearer picture comes into light, and you can maybe weigh the evidence more in that direction. Say, okay, this looks like harmonization because there's a lot of this going on in this particular manuscript. So but that's not the same thing as a bias towards MT, right? It's trying to take into account larger patterns, if you will, in terms of how the scribes are working. I hope this answers your question. Or yeah.
Just as I hear you in that response, and I'm thinking throughout this presentation, the discussion, that there's also the basic reality that we're dealing with from where we are now, where we're preoccupied with this notion of the genuine article. Like, give me the best translation for all times, for all places. Like, I just need to know the genuine article. And the anxiety that can be induced, that Joel was getting at, when it feels like we can't get to the general sort of source code, right? And of course, I'm always speaking from the perspective of a theologian who always messes up the conversation and these sorts of things. But it really pushes, for me, all sorts of ways of thinking about the doctrines that we hold to be true as a part of our tradition that we've inherited. So basically Christology, right? I mean, the basic point that even when the disciples are standing next to the incarnate Word of God, they're still trying to figure out what's going on. Like, trying to figure out who he really is, and you can't ever really get down to the depths of who he. There's always more to see, and you're still wrestling, even when the genuine article, so to speak, is staring you in the face. And so, how does these types of conversations that we're having actually stir up this idea of a totally genuine article? And even if we were looking at it, that we'd be able to sort of fully say, "Aha, I've got it," right? And so. It almost, to me, on the other side of the anxiety, there could be this sort of don't want to go there, or there could be a renewed enchantment or wonder with the gifts that God has given us in all these different bits and pieces, and maybe like have this feeling that we have a total grasp on everything. Maybe that illusory grasp is lightened a little bit. So we have some other questions here too, I think. But there's one online as well. From Chris, he said, since you specialize in Deuteronomy, what do you think of the differences in chapter 30, verse 3 and 30, verse 6, which are referring to captivity healing and circumcised purge? That's also in the chat box if you want to take a look.
Yeah, I saw that. The second one I haven't looked at in detail. The first one, chapter 30, verse 3 is very intriguing. Because the Hebrew expression there for captivity is difficult. Even in modern translations, the way how to translate this expression, returning your captivity, shuv shavut, I think is the expression is very difficult to render, and there's debates about it. But it seems like the Septuagint translator here is not going that direction at all. It's going completely different in terms of healing your sins, right? If I recall. Let me see if I can find it. Yes, and the Net's translation says, and the Lord will heal your sins and have mercy on you. Yeah, so that's a very striking difference from the Masoretic text. It's not the type of solution that you would usually find when you encounter this expression. So I've wondered where this might come from. It seems to be what we call a theological rendering. It's an interpretation of the Hebrew that sends us in a slightly different direction. Is it that because the translator understands the return of captivity in a larger context of forgiveness and healing and all that? That might be. I've read someone once who said that there's a connection here with Hosea, who has a similar expression. I haven't tried to track it down, and I haven't, but that's something I want to pursue further. So in that case, there might be the influence of other biblical, might call it, or scriptural traditions that might have influenced this rendering into Greek. That's also possible. We see that in other places where the broader, we might say canonical, if that may not be the appropriate term, but the broader scriptural context seems to be informing decisions in particular cases, and that might be an instance of this here.
Thank you. We have another question here from Mikhail. Which translation and books are most recommended for someone who wants to learn the more technical details while having a basic Greek knowledge?
Well, if you're entirely new to the Septuagint, I would suggest that you start with an introduction. There are several that are available that are very good. At a very basic level that doesn't require any knowledge of Hebrew and Greek, you have a small book by Will Ross. It's called Will Ross and Greg Lanier, I think, what the Septuagint, what it is and why it matters. It's probably $20 or somewhere around there. But if you really want to, if you have some knowledge of Greek and you want to learn more about the field, there's an excellent one by Karen Jobes and Moses Silva, which is in the second edition, which is a very thorough introduction. And will introduce you to many of the things I've discussed here, but in more detail. The history of research on the Septuagint and things like that. So I would probably start there. If you want to know more about Septuagint research, if you're interested in like particular books and their characteristics, like what is the style of Septuagint Genesis, what is its what are the tendencies of the translator, where does he maybe put his imprint in terms of theological renderings and things of that nature. There are some handbooks that are out there now that shed light on these issues. You have the T.N.T. Clark handbook, the Septuagint, I think, that was edited by Jim Aitken. that's a more pricey volume, but if you can access it through a library or in Logos, that's probably better. Otherwise, Baylor also has one out that was it's a translation of a German introduction that's also similar, going book by book and trying to highlight the characteristics of each. So I guess that would be two ways of approaching the Septuagint as a newcomer, I guess.
Other questions or comments?
I might add that maybe if you have a little Greek, the best thing to do would be to do a little bit of reading each day. That's a very good. That's probably the best way to get acquainted with the Septuagint. Pick a text, maybe some narrative at first, and work through it. And yeah, that's a good way to explore and get acquainted.
Joel, maybe while people are gathering their thoughts for another question or comment, do you want to bring in? I know that you have probably a list of things that you could share. So I'd love to give you a little bit of space to do that if you like.
I mean, sure, yeah, if we want to wait for more comments to come in. Just as a note to David Morcillo, and we actually had two questions. Is that two questions about the crushing the head?
No, this is
Neil?
a response
Okay.
to the original
Oh, there we
question.
go. Okay, yeah. I started researching.
Examining my Zoom moderation skills.
You're a theologian.
You can't be trusted. Yeah.
Can't trust you with the
I'm
details.
censoring and redacting and interpreting that. No, I would never do such a thing.
Michael and I, this is like a consistent just joke across the office.
We're colleagues. It's
Yeah.
See, we're human too. We like to joke. It's fun. Yeah.
Anyways, yeah, just to David's question, you can always look in commentaries too. So there's like John William Weaver's commentary on Genesis that's out there and available, which I actually looked up while you are after that question just to check for you. And yeah, it's just a tough word. So shuv for the crushing the head. It's not particularly clear. It's only used 3 times in the Hebrew Bible, and so it seems like the translator kind of went for something. Whereas in later recensions or later translations of the Hebrew Bible, so Aquila and Symmachus, these are later translators from the 1st and 2nd century CE, they do go back to the crushing element. So maybe what Paul has, or maybe what Paul's getting at, he's more familiar with that, or with the Hebrew tradition or something like that. But yeah, it does seem to differ from the Old Greeks, that being the original 3rd century translation of Genesis. If that helps you, David. Do we get any more comments while I said that? I don't grandstand.
No, keep going.
Okay. I mean, it would be the same questions that I had earlier. Did you want to speak a little bit to some of the more grand divergences? Maybe let people know about them, and perhaps what you might think about them.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, you mentioned Jeremiah. This is probably the most obvious situation there. Exodus is another place, the tabernacle account, where we find portions that are in a different order in the Septuagint, and a few are different or missing. So there's been a lot of discussions and debates on this. If we look at the Jeremiah situation, where, as you said, that the Septuagint version is about 1/8 shorter. Not only that, the oracles to the nations are found in the middle, right after the first half of chapter 25, where it talks about Jeremiah's mandate to be a prophet to the nations. It breaks. You find the oracles right there, and then the rest of the book resuming after that. So in this case, most scholars think that we're dealing with actually 2 different literary editions of the book, not just isolated differences. And so there are still a minority of scholars who think that the Greek was made from the Masoretic text but condensed. But personally, I don't find the argument very convincing. Actually, what makes it difficult is that it actually works in some cases, a minority of cases. But if you look at the overall picture, it does seem like there were additions made to an earlier version of the book, additions and a reshuffling of the contents. And so what do we make of that, right? And especially since it seems like additions mean that there's an earlier version and a later version. Now, if this runs into the other one of the principles that I stated earlier of textual criticism, is just trying to get to the earliest recoverable text, right? So on that account, what should we do with Jeremiah? Should we ignore the Masoretic text because it's later and just go for the Septuagint text? Or should we try to instead, should we adopt the Masoretic text? Would that be a bias towards MT, as you mentioned earlier? Well, I don't think there's an easy answer here. What some have done is they're trying to put together an eclectic edition of the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, where you have two columns and you have the two texts. So you'll have the longer version in one column with some of the additions. By the way, the additions are often longer introductions, like for the dating of the oracles, harmonizations from within the book. So a few verses are taken or expressions taken from elsewhere and added. We're not talking about, for the most part, very significant changes if you look at the message of the book, right? Still, so some would put them side by side, produce an eclectic edition. But I think what most Bible translators do, or translation committees do, is that they probably approach the issue from the perspective of which is the text that is most complete, the most complete stage of the text, right? And like I said, this runs a little bit against the principles of textual criticism that I mentioned earlier. But in this scenario, you would see the Masoretic text, the Masoretic version of Jeremiah, as the most finished product, right? And the Septuagint edition as a preliminary edition, if you will. And so then they would adopt the Masoretic text with, of course, comparing like every other text, see if it can be improved, but not trying to go beyond that to an earlier edition. So the Masoretic text will be used as the canonical text, if you will, as a basis for our Bibles. But like I said, that will depend on how you approach a plurality of editions in cases such as this, Jeremiah being probably the clearest example that we have.
Very helpful. One of the things I was wondering is, among many things, is how does tradition, like the way in which we define tradition, the way in which we locate tradition, like where exactly we locate it, when quote unquote tradition starts, and where it sort of reaches a climax, as it were, or just continues going, right? So even in like the formation of the canon, how does tradition inform that, or the traditions of the different texts that you're looking at? Like, how is that informing? Like, a lot hinges on what we mean when we say tradition and how that is shaping the decisions that we're making, or the decisions that we're making about the decisions that people were making when they were translating. You know what I mean? So yeah, I'd be interested to hear you comment on this idea of tradition, and how is it implicitly, explicitly being defined and shaping your understanding of what's going on in this type of work that you're doing, which is very intricate.
Yeah, tradition is important at many levels. Sometimes when we compare the Greek and the Hebrew texts, we try to abstract the Masoretic vocalization, the vowel points, because that's actually a tradition, a reading tradition. And if in many cases you can see the Septuagint translators reading the same consonants but with different vowels, so they're operating with a different reading tradition, or maybe ad hoc, trying to make sense of the text as best as they can. So already in their context, there seems to be, at least for some books, a reading tradition that's helping them make sense even of difficult passages that give us a lot of trouble even today. So you have tradition in that context. Their Hebrew text is not read de novo, like as with nothing in mind, but they're themselves in a tradition, a reading tradition, an interpretative tradition. Then you can also look at it from the perspective of the canon, I suppose, and think through the Jeremiah issue from the perspective of tradition as well, which form of the book has the Jewish tradition. I'm using the singular, that's probably problematic here, but some might say mainstream or majority Judaism have adopted, right, as their exemplar, right? And so and that would be the MT version of the book. And so some would argue, well, we received, as Paul says, the scriptures, Romans 9, from the Jews, so that should be the tradition that we take over from them, and we therefore adopt the longer version, the MT text. So that's another way that we can deal with tradition in that context, from more of a canonical standpoint. But anyway, canon issues are complex, right? Because even within Judaism, you find a variety of schools of thought and even a variety of canons, probably. But yeah, you have to look as to where the river is flowing, I guess, and then decide if that's the river you want to swim in, I suppose.
Exactly. No, that
metaphor.
Right. If we had, if tradition, as we're speaking about here, had like a relationship status on social media, it's complicated, right? And that, but I think this, like, on one way you can receive that as an anxiety-inducing thing, as a thing to be denied, as a thing to be afraid of, or you can actually receive that as a very wondrous thing that all of it, in one way, shape, or form, is bearing witness in a way to a God that is living and entrusts us with these words, and it's carrying it forward from the different perspectives. And so, like, how do we receive that not as something to be terrified of, but something to be received with wonder? Like, and I think sometimes it's very easy to lose sight of that it's not that actually, if you think this is the way that God chose to do it, is quite a wondrous thing. Like, it would have just been easier to sort of just give us the true text and just, that way, but that's not the way that it did. And that says more about God than it says about our own personal reliability as readers and hearers of those words. So someone has asked, Don here has asked, among English translations, there are some that rarely use the Septuagint reading, some that use the Septuagint more frequently than other translations, and some that are in between, Goldilocks. So where would you fall in terms of how much you prefer Septuagint readings? Do you think our English translations should be following Septuagint readings more than they do now?
Well, you can probably guess my answer here, and yes, they should do. Well, you have to understand that translation committees are generally very conservative, right? And in fact, many translations never really start from scratch. You're taking an existing translation and you're revising it, and so there has to be a strong impetus to change things that have been part of the tradition, right? And so unless you're doing something totally new, and so this is why I think we often find the same renderings or same textual variants carried over from one version to the other, because the priority is not to innovate or to look at all the evidence all over again. There are other priorities for these projects. So I think we should, the translation should be more open to integrate Septuagint readings, especially when you have a consensus in the textual criticism community that it is a superior reading. Like I said before, though, there are a lot of situations where it's not as clear. So in that case, okay, well, it might be conservatively you would choose to hold on to the traditional reading, which is the MT reading in many cases. But all right, that can be justified on a philosophical basis. Okay, this is the way we want to operate in the terms of this translation project. That's okay, because you have to decide at some point. You have to make a choice, right? The translators don't have the option of printing both variants or translating two different ways. You have to decide. So yeah, in that case, I think it's inevitable. You either you have to fall back on some position or other, and it would seem to make sense to fall back on a more conservative one in many cases. Yeah.
Anybody in person? I see I see a Ken IL sticker, so we have some translators there. And I always know that the Ken IL folks are up for some good comments and questions. So not to assume, but I'm going to assume that maybe, yeah, if we have some folks from Ken IL, you might. And for viewers online who aren't familiar, it's the Canadian Institute for Linguistics and really wonderful translation. Yeah, let's hear from the translators. That was another word I wanted to zero in on, actually, right? Translation. The whole point of translation is thinking carefully about how the sending language is being received and making the sending language intelligible to the receptor. So that's another thing that's right. Like translation is all about thinking seriously about the audience that is hearing and how you might not modify it, but represent or portray it in a way so that the people who are hearing it can hear it. I don't know if properly is the right word, but I'll just use it for lack of a better term.
Yeah, I mean, in all of our translation classes, we're kind of, and I believe you've taken principles of translation, so you might be able to speak better to this, but we're constantly thinking about how is this translation going to be received by the people. We're never translating into a vacuum. And so at least whenever I'm looking at text criticism, which isn't all that much, honestly, but whenever I am, I'm also thinking about how are the traditions that I've been raised in too affecting my own interpretation and affecting which readings I'm choosing. And so I think your comments about tradition are really, really important. I don't think there's really a question so much tagged to that, but that's kind of input that maybe you have.
Yeah, we in principles of translation, we're taught there are 4 key things that we look for in every translation. Clarity, is it clear to the audience? Is it natural to the audience? So it could be clear, but totally sounds very foreign. Clarity, accuracy, so is it along the lines of what the original text actually said, or are we saying something completely heretical without meaning to because we don't know the language? Or like, and then the last one's acceptability. And so just like, are we translating it in in a style that they're not going to read, or are they going to read the style we're translating into? So those are like the 4 things that we look at when we do translations.
Yeah, I've actually been a part of discussions on this of the immense work that goes into translations, and then it's not even distributed in a way where it can be accessed, or the way in which it's done. It's not actually primed in a way or done in a way that the people who are actually receiving can really receive it well, practically speaking. And how do all of those sorts of nuances again inform what we're thinking when we're thinking about the people who are involved in these translations where they're not using the tools and information sources that we are, and how do those even basically shape it? I mean, it's all just so fascinating and wonderful to think about how nevertheless it all still comes to us in a life-changing way. Yeah, go for it. Absolutely.
I appreciate very much your discussion tonight. The question I have for you is, when you come across disagreements between the Septuagint text, and I'm not saying Rolf says the Septuagint text, but say Old Greek, and the Masoretic, how often do you get a scrolls reading that agrees with the Septuagint versus the Masoretic? Because you were showing in the tree today that there was a lot of readings on the Septuagint side, or or even I suppose on the Masoretic side, that do have agreement with scrolls text, and of course the scrolls is a more challenging question to begin with. But how would you roughly evaluate it, at least in a ballpark figures, and in terms not just of the whole Hebrew Bible, but also maybe in terms of, say, particular books like you're more familiar with, some maybe in Deuteronomy?
Mhm. Yeah, you're right. The examples that I provided are all had or most of them had a Qumran fragment that supported the Septuagint reading, but there are many cases where that's not the case, where the Septuagint is the only witness that contains this variant. So, in terms of statistics, I don't have a number to provide right offhand. Emmanuel Tov has published a series of articles on each book of the Pentateuch where he talks about harmonizing tendencies, and he shows statistics of how often does MT agree with the Samaritan Pentateuch, but not the Septuagint, or how often does the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Septuagint agree against MT. So he provides statistics along those lines. But I mean, intuitively, I would say that there's probably over half, if not more, of the variants that we encounter that are unique to the Septuagint, that are not supported by either a Qumran manuscript or the Samaritan Pentateuch. But what's interesting is that, as I showed in the tree, the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Septuagint source text, they go back to a common ancestor before they reach the archetype or MT, and so you'll often find them sharing variants, especially in harmonizations. I say often, but it's recognized that Septuagint harmonizes even more than the Samaritan Pentateuch does. So that raises the question: okay, who's doing the harmonizing here? Is it the translator when he's translating, or is it his Hebrew source text that was already further along in this harmonization process than the Samaritan Pentateuch? That's difficult to decide, but since we often see the same patterns reoccurring, I tend to think that this is done at the level of the Hebrew. And so in many such cases where we find this kind of harmonization, I tend to argue that this is not something the translator does, but it's already part of his source text, even though we don't have a Qumran fragment or another Hebrew witness to support that decision. I come to that decision more from a pattern perspective approach than material support.
I guess my follow-up to that would be, is there a possibility the Samaritan Pentateuch will finally get a tiny bit of respect then?
Yeah. Well, I think it is. They're publishing a critical edition of the Samaritan Pentateuch. The Leviticus volume has come out, and others are on the way. So yeah, that was one of the difficulties with the Samaritan Pentateuch, is that we had an edition from Von Gaal. I think it's from the 15th century or 1500s. I don't recall exactly, and it's not a full edition. So it's a text that's difficult to use if you don't have a specialized skill set, and maybe that explains in part why it's not doesn't have as much respect as it should have. Let's put it that way.
Well, it could very well be that it's an indie band versus top 40, right? I mean, that's maybe what we're dealing with here, is that the one is the more indie label, the more avant-garde, and maybe one is more top 40.
I being more of a top 40 guy in my music, but I'm more of an indie guy when it comes to textual criticism, because I'm a New Testament guy, but I've often wondered why there's an assumption that the Samaritan Pentateuch must, by definition, be wrong. You don't even have to check. The assumption is it must be wrong. Because I was at an SPL lecture one time, and it was decided beforehand that there had to be harmonizations. The SP was wrong. Well, I know maybe it's like the Western text, which is usually wrong. We don't trust it in the New Testament side, but does it mean it's 100, 1000% always wrong? And I know in Gallagher's nice work for students and for people who aren't experts, I think he pointed out that maybe about 5% of the time the pre-SP might be the superior text in what people are looking at.
Yeah.
I was curious if you could follow that up, because one of the messages that's coming to me tonight, and I think Joel mentioned it really as well, as much as we respect the MT, maybe, just maybe, when we read all those wonderful old Greek quotes in Acts that reference the Septuagint, and their reading is different than, say, the Masoretic, maybe it wasn't a Christian invention as much as this was the Vorlage that they were working with for the Greek as well, and it really starts to change my understanding of, I don't know, maybe the last 200 years of German theology, you know.
Yeah. In a similar lecture, I did another lecture recently where I went through Amos 9 and Acts 15 with the students when you compare the Masoretic text, the Septuagint, and then the New Testament text. Very interesting. In fact, the bulk of the shift, you might say, that occurs between the Masoretic text and the New Testament is actually done in the Septuagint. That's where the most significant interpretative or different reading tradition emerges, and then the New Testament author doesn't have to do much afterwards to integrate that into well, what's this, James's speech, right, in Acts 15 to his decision, the decision that's made concerning the Gentiles there. But yeah, to go back to the Samaritan Pentateuch, maybe I think what threw off scholars for the past generations is the fact that it was labeled as a kind of a sectarian text, right? There was an overlay of sectarian readings that are particular to the Samaritans. You know, at the end of the Ten Commandments, there's an addition there to sacrifice in Sichem, and then you have this phrase in Deuteronomy, the place that the Lord your God has chosen or will choose, MT. But my sense is that recent research has tended to push back on this and think that maybe some of these were not quote unquote sectarian readings after all. And that maybe, I mean, you have Adrian Schenker, which is a well-known text critic, who's arguing that the Samaritan Pentateuch might actually be the original reading here, that the place that the Lord has chosen might be original and not the empty future Yiktol form there. So I think we're seeing a bit of a shift from what you described. But still, it's hard to get away from the fact that there is a lot of harmonizing. So that's why I said earlier, it's not very helpful to start with negative or positive preconceptions about each manuscript. It's better to evaluate each cases on their own, then look for patterns, and not start with, oh, this is MT, so it must be better, or this is Samaritan Pentateuch, so it must be secondary. That doesn't. I don't think that does justice to the evidence.
That's actually a revolutionary concept.
Okay.
There's an awful lot, especially if you read the older literature, the assumptions that are baked in. I'll just leave it because it's not my place, but taking each text at face value is a bit new, because I still remember the SPL lecture, and there was no way the SP could actually have anything worthwhile saying. And I remember thinking, well, the one thing they didn't ask is if it could actually be true. Mm-hmm. Assumption was from the beginning it had to be wrong. And I just was like, I was flabbergasted, because I'm no expert on it, but it was like, they didn't even raise that question. So
yeah. Well, one of the new trends in textual criticism is similar to the one I was describing for translations. Instead of using prescriptive judgments like errors or original or corruptions, there's a shift towards using a more descriptive language, like this is a earlier or later, and not better or worse or true or false. And so I think that's a move in the right direction. Yeah, so I guess I'll leave it at that. It supports your comment there.
That's very helpful. Just conscious of time here. Probably have time for one more question or comment before we close for the evening. But you did experience it. The revolutionary work is happening here. So everyone here, you know, it's happening, right? So yeah, one more question or comment before we close for the evening.
If I just fill the space a bit, I'm showing my age, but it was 30 years ago I took my Septuagint course. And the thing I can still barely remember for it was kai, 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 va, 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 literal translation, bad, 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 or at least
Yeah.
should be. And what you're telling me today is really a paradigm shift, and I appreciate it, because if they weren't so literal, it would be very hard to, you know, find the Hebrew Vorlage or whatever terminology is now used. And as much as I appreciated that course, and it didn't get as much as maybe some of my contemporaries, the thing was, Kai and Va, well, you should never always do that. Well, that's the way they did it. And I do understand that, but it is revolutionary. It really is, because the assumption was that you were supposed to say, well, they should have done a better job. And I figured, these guys have been dead for 2,000 years. I don't know if I want to criticize them, you know.
But you're right, and I think one of the reasons for this paradigm shift is that our knowledge of post-classical Greek has made incredible progress in the last 30 years, and it's fairly easy now to access a huge corpus of not only classical but also post-classical texts, whether that's more literary works or papyri, inscriptions. You can do searches. I mean, Joel could tell you a lot more about this in terms of legal material, but that's still changing the way we see Greek. I mean, it's just starting in a way, and we're learning more and more about how people communicated, their different registers of Greek, their styles. Anyway, even vocabulary sometimes, that we find occurrences of words that support a sense that we find contextually in the Septuagint, but that was otherwise unattested before. So yeah, it seems like I don't want to say every day, but we were making continued progress along those lines, and I'm sure that the picture will continue to get clearer in the coming years and decades.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for ending that way, because that was one thing that I was thinking about. I once knew a person who was an airplane mechanic, and I'll end with an analogy here. And as airplane mechanics, you're told never to work on your checks and repairs based on memory. Like, even when you think you've memorized everything that you're supposed to do to check the mechanics of the plane you're working on, you always use the manual, because you may misremember or you may get lazy. And the point being is that I think this is a really good reminder of wherever we're coming from in these sorts of discussions, that always getting the manual or manuals in view, and never thinking that we have it totally nailed down, but actually going back with curiosity, going back to new insights that when they come, that we never think that we've totally got it memorized, but that actually there's always more to discover. And I think you've really, prompted us to do that in your presentation and the conversation. So thank you very much. And that really is the point. It's like, this is the point of In the Book, is we want to get people in the book and the world of the text. And so thank you very much. Yeah, someone said open-mindedness. Yes, open-mindedness is key. Curiosity is key.
Can I make a quick plea as we finish?
You can make a plea, Joel.
20 seconds. As in light of what John is saying about all the new data, the new tools we have, the databases online, we can both say with great confidence there is so much work to be done. if you're interested, and anybody's online, anyone here is interested in Septuagint studies, do it. This is the time. This is because there is just way more work than anyone can do. There are way more things to be found than anyone can do, and we just need more people. Yeah, it's truly a golden time for this kind of research.
And just to add to that endorsement, I don't know if this is still true. You can confirm for it not, but funding. There's funding in this because if you put the word ancient on anything, it actually really is more likely to get you funding if you just say, "I'm a theologian, give me money." So, so very practically speaking,
I think
education is expensive.
yeah.
So, it's also advantageous to pick streams where, funding can get you to where you want to go. So also very practical as well.
Get a good project, but yeah,
Yeah.
possible.
Yes,
I mean,
also
John-
get a
John
good
and I both-
project.
I think we
Yeah.
both had funding for Septuagint stuff, so it's totally possible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so please join me in thanking Dr. Maurais and Bill for taking the back. Thank you everyone who joined us online and in person. We plan to have more events like this. We want to have one in the spring. We're still in the works thinking about it, but we want to actually look at there's a few scholars in the Northwest ecosystem that are working on scriptural responses to climate change and eco-dread, the phenomenon of eco-dread. So that's something that we're thinking about doing in the spring. So if you stay connected with us, like online, you'll hear about those things when they come, and we'd love to have you. And if you know somebody like we need to have them do something like this, come talk to me. I'd love to hear your pitch because we want to do things that are engaging for everybody who's showing up to these events. So thanks for your time, and thank you to Andy as always for running the tech. Yeah, appreciate it. And yeah, we'll see you at the next event. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
John.
Bienvenue.
Send it to Times.